On the morning of May 25th, 2011, I attempted suicide by tying a rope into a hangman's noose, putting it around my neck, and then jumping from a log, much like the one you see in this photo. Obviously something went wrong, and I survived. Later, someone told me I was lucky, but that's not what I was feeling at the time. I wanted to end my life that day, and I was bitterly disappointed to find myself alive. The scars you see are from the rope burn I got when the hangman's noose unraveled. As you can imagine, it hurt. What hurt even more is I didn't have the energy or capacity to try again. It had taken more than 4 hours of hiking through the park to find a suitable spot, and before that, months and months of anguish. I was exhausted, mentally and physically. I had nothing left. I was done. Now that you know a little of my story, let's step back and take a look at suicide's causes, consequences, and perhaps some of the answers. Currently, there are strong cultural taboos in discussing suicide. Secondly, nearly everyone who attempts or dies by suicide has a mental illness at the time, which for many is seen as a character flaw. As long as mental illness and suicide are stigmatized, it'll remain a hidden but very real public health threat and a source of terrible pain for everyone who's been affected. My hope is that change can occur where suicide and mental illness are no longer stigmatized and the cost and impact on families and society diminished. A reframe is the ability to see a set of facts in an entirely new way. Let me give you an example. In the 1984 presidential election, Ronald Reagan's age became a factor. At the time, he was 73 and Walter Mondale, his opponent, was 56. In the first presidential debate, Reagan didn't do very well, and it was thought to be because of his age. In the second debate, a journalist asked Reagan whether or not he was fit to be president and whether or not his age was going to be an impediment to his ability to do the job. Here's how he responded.
I will not make age an issue of this campaign. I am not going to exploit, for political purposes, my opponent's youth and inexperience.
As you can imagine, his age was never again a factor in the campaign. Can you see how he skillfully reframed the facts so that we saw them in an entirely different way? So now that we know about reframe, what are the facts about suicide? This pie chart shows us the leading causes of death in the U.S. for the most current year of 2013. And as you can see, suicide is last on the list and the smallest wedge in our pie chart. So while suicide is a leading cause of death, it doesn't get much of our attention. After all of us have been affected in some way by heart disease, cancer, and respiratory diseases, as well as all the attention these causes get through fundraising and charities. So it's no wonder they stand out in our minds. There are about 40,000 suicides per year on average in the U.S. and about 16,000 homicides. Are you surprised? Are you surprised that there are more suicides than murders? That in fact there are 2.5 times more suicides than homicides? Furthermore, it's believed that for every suicide there are 25 attempts, which is about 1 million per year in the U.S. So even though the number of suicides is startling enough, it's minuscule compared to the number of people like me who've attempted suicide. Suicide has an enormous cost to our society. The Center for Disease Control estimates that on average, a suicide costs about $1 million. And that totals $34 billion in medical costs and lost work productivity. Most tragic of all, 6 to 32 surviving family members, friends, and colleagues who will suffer and grieve their loss. So the next time you hear of a murder, let me ask you to take a moment to consider that in that same time, There have been 3 suicides and 75 attempts. When someone commits the murder, it makes the news. When someone dies by suicide, nothing. It's silence. Yet the facts are, suicide happens much more often and is much more likely to affect our families and our society. How does someone get to a place where suicide seems like the best option? In fact, the only option. Over 90% of the people who attempt or die by suicide have a mental illness at the time, and the most common mental illness is depression. Depression makes suicide seem like a reasonable way to solve the problems you face. In fact, studies have shown that in 100% of cases, suicide is seen as a solution for emotional pain and hopelessness. Now, you may say suicide's not a solution, but that's what makes depression so insidious. When you're depressed, suicide looks like it makes sense. You might be wondering, what does depression feel like? Depression's not the same for everyone, but what everyone with depression has in common, you don't feel like yourself. Depression, the medical term, could really use a different name. Today, we use the word depressed to mean everything from feeling a bit miserable to having a clinical mental disorder, which is a little like comparing someone who's had a paper cut to someone who's had their arm amputated. It's not the same. For me, depression didn't feel like anything, or at least what does empty and hopeless feel like? What it did feel like is a never-ending and ever smaller tunnel. What it did feel like is excruciating. After my attempt, I received an unexpected gift: the unconditional love and support of my partner, Jennifer, and 2 of my brothers, Roy. Roy and Jim, with whom she shared my secret. It's with their help that I survived. At the time, I didn't think their help was available. That was my partner, Jennifer. Clearly, I was wrong. It's another example of how depression corrodes your thinking. A dilemma is a situation where you need to make a choice between 2 equally unattractive options. On 9/11, many people fell to their death from the World Trade Center. Consider their dilemma: death by fire or by jumping. They made the choice that jumping was preferable to the excruciating pain of the fire. On May 25th, 2011, I made the choice that jumping from a log with a rope around my neck was preferable to the excruciating pain of my depression. Now, you may wonder, is the pain of the fire and the pain of the depression the same? I don't know. It's hard to know for sure. What I do know for sure is in the throes of our respective dilemmas, we made the same choice. Here's the thing. I understand the situation isn't exactly the same. But let me ask you to imagine the horror the people in the World Trade Center must have faced. And if you can imagine that, then you can also imagine the feeling of being trapped in an intolerable situation. And that's what makes depression sometimes make suicide possible. When thinking about suicide, people often say one of 3 things. First, some people say that suicide is an act of cowardice. Do you think the people that jumped off the World Trade Center took the coward's way out that day? My guess is you don't. No one attempts or dies by suicide because they want to die. Suicide's not an act of cowardice. It's a desperate act to get relief from the pain. Secondly, some people say suicide is selfish. Are the people who get cancer or heart disease selfish? Of course not. Getting a clinical mental disorder affects your ability to think, your mood, and your judgment. Suicide's not the problem. Rather, it's the result of the underlying illness. Rather than ask why the suicide, ask why the pain. And third, some people say that suicide's a cry for help. One Harvard study of 286 people found that 42% agreed with the statement, "My suicide attempt was a cry for help. I did not mean to die." The majority, 58%, agreed with the statement, "I made a serious attempt to kill myself. I'm lucky to be alive." In my case, I made a serious attempt, and I am lucky to be alive. Do you know that by the late 1980s, 30 of the 50 US states had no laws against suicide? That by 1993, suicide was largely decriminalized? At the time of my attempt, I had a vague notion that suicide was criminal, which is part of the reason I didn't seek or get medical attention. So how did I get the attention I needed? This is a CT scan. And just for reference, the white spot you see inside the red circle is my spine. And what you're seeing is a cross-section of my body at the level of my liver. The dark spot with the red indicator is a liter of infected fluid. As a result, my liver had expanded, compressing my lungs and stomach so much I couldn't breathe or eat. I'd lost 30 pounds in the 6 weeks before this scan was taken. It was on my third attempt at emergency that I finally got admitted to hospital. And in doing a full medical intake, the facts of the suicide attempt from 3 months earlier became known, and I was given psychiatric care. Isn't it ironic? I did not get treatment for my mental health until I got admitted to hospital for my physical health. My liver condition gets attention, my mental health condition doesn't. Even me, someone who attempted suicide, had a stigma. A stigma is a mark of disgrace associated with a particular circumstance, quality, or person. And speaking of stigmas, is depression a mental illness or a character flaw? And secondly, who or what do you think of when you think of people with mental illness? Is this what you think of? People living on the margins of society? The only people with mental health issues are people with issues? Or perhaps you think of the man who was thought to have a mental illness who committed the mass shooting at Sandy Hook Elementary in Newtown, Connecticut. Or maybe your model of mental illness is shaped by the movies like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest with that oppressive head nurse Ratched. And that the best way to treat mental illness is with a lobotomy. If that's what comes to mind for you, perhaps it'll surprise you that Jim Carrey, who's made a career of making us laugh, has depression. He's battled it for decades. After returning from the moon, Buzz Aldrin coped with depression. After all, he'd been to the moon and back. What was there left to live for? Hey, do you know that song by Elton John called Someone Saved My Life Tonight? It's about his suicide attempt in 1969. And that Billy Joel has long coped with depression, and in 1970 he attempted suicide. And even tough-as-nails football players like Brandon Marshall can have a mental illness. And with the shocking death of Robin Williams, we learned that he'd coped with depression and mental illness for decades. So the people with mental illness are not just the people on the margins of society. People with mental illness are just like me and some of you. That's right, 1 in 4 people has a mental health problem. And many more people have a problem with that. Let me put it another way. This room holds about 400 people. And that means about 100 of us have had a mental illness in our lifetime. So what I'm going to ask you to do is take a look to your left, look to your right, and as you look to your left and right, try to identify who has the mental illness. If you can't identify who it is, maybe it's you. Now's the time to get the facts about mental illness and suicide, because as long as mental illness and suicide are stigmatized, it'll remain a hidden but very real public health threat. The Director General of the World Health Organization says that mental illness is not a personal failure. If there's a failure to be found, it's in the way we've responded to people with mental and brain disorders. Treatment is available, but nearly 2/3 of the people with a known mental illness never seek help from a health professional. Our society and culture will support the people with physical illness, but often not the people with mental illness. Gandhi famously said, "Be the change that you wish to see in the world." And that's why I'm speaking up. That's why I'm asking for the world to change. I've chosen to reveal something about myself that I've hidden for too long. My mental illness and my depression are no longer a secret. I'm outing myself on this stage. I'm willing to face the stigma because if I'm silent, the stigma just continues to exist. I'm going to offer you 3 ways to end the stigma and be the change that you wish to see in the world. First, change your language. A lot of the stigmas we have show up in the language we use. Using language like psycho, schizo, retard, nuts, loony, spastic, and a screw is loose just perpetuates the myths. Social stigma is pervasive. The U.S. National Medicine Institute has a list of 250 labels people use to stigmatize those with mental illness. Change your language so that it becomes more understanding. Start that understanding by educating yourself. Although the exact cause of most mental illness is not known, it's becoming clear through research that it's a combination of psychological, biological, social, and environmental factors. Mental illness is not a flaw in character. Get the facts so that we can stop the stigma. And third, let's talk about it. The elephant in the room is a metaphor for an obvious truth that's being ignored or unspoken. The best way to deal with an elephant? To name it. Get it out in the open. Let's talk openly about how mental illness and suicide affects us all, either directly or through a family member, colleague, or a friend. Let's talk openly about mental illness and suicide as part of normal life. At the beginning of this talk, I described a reframe as the ability to see the same set of facts in an entirely new way. And that's what I've been able to do, a personal reframe. As Andrew Solomon says in his TED Talk, the opposite of depression is not happiness. It's vitality. I've gone from wanting to die to wanting to live because of my renewed vitality. And that's my hope for this talk, that we as a society can reframe how we view mental illness and suicide. Because as we do, we'll make care, treatment, help and support more accessible, and that'll diminish the costs and impact on our families and our society. Because if not us, then who? If not now, when? Let's recognize that most people who attempt or die by suicide don't want to die. They just want relief from the pain. Rather than ask why the suicide, ask why the pain. Let's see mental illness for what it is. It's an illness, just like any other. Everyone with an illness deserves care, help, treatment, and support. The reframe in how we view mental illness and suicide starts with us. It starts with me. It can start with you. Are you willing to join me? Let's change the world.